Thanks everybody for attending. It's going to be a great webinar today. We have a lot of great information. We'll be focusing specifically on testing in regulated industries. Before we kind of get into some content, and it's relative to today's topic too. So I'm a solution architect on the TestRail platform. Again, my name is Faraglia. The majority of my career, I've held various positions in actual software engineering, development, technical product management, and a large chunk of it in software testing related roles, specifically in healthcare IT and a long stint in nuclear power, nuclear generation here in the US and North America. So this topic is very close and very interesting for me, testing in regulated environments, because that's been a big chunk of my career. So let's just get started and talk about background. We start thinking about like these regulated, and that's a very generic topic, right? We say regulated industries. What do we really mean by that? So whenever we define regulated industries, and again, we have a good number of attendees today, and I'm sure everybody has a pretty diverse and kind of vast experience of the domains that you're currently working in. This is just a short list. I've worked in really two of them as core for healthcare and kind of energy, but it may be manufacturing, banking, healthcare. We mentioned energy, telecom, transportation, agriculture, and these may be regulated by both government entities. It also could be regulated by, like I said, agencies, compliance environments, or regulatory bodies. So there's different areas where we will get into what I'll call like that regulated kind of domain where we have these additional requirements. But again, these are just a sampling of what we can consider regulated. There's probably a lot more, but really the overarching theme, as I mentioned, where we have these added requirements for not only being thorough in our testing, but we have added things for what we're testing, how we're documenting it, how we're managing it release to release. And then the other thing, obviously, is how we're measured with that. And that a lot of times is around audits and assessments of the work and the traceability being done. So we'll get into that in some more detail. So that gives you a little background. So when I mention regulated, this is really what we're thinking about. So what are some common characteristics? I know I already mentioned a few of these, but some of the main things that are shared across these regulated environments and really put more demands on, I guess, as a software tester, leader, or those that are working or operating these business environments. One of the big things is implementation of data requirements and privacy restrictions. If we're maybe doing an e-commerce business or just doing some type of online retail, which I'm definitely not downplaying, but that becomes slightly different whenever we pivot to industries, for example, like healthcare, where we're dealing with patient data, or maybe government entities, or maybe defense industries, where data requirements and privacy restrictions are really taken to the next level. And it becomes potential challenges whenever we start to overlay that with data we need for testing. And we'll get into that a little more in the presentation, but how we actually implement our requirements and testing related to privacy and data restrictions is something that is definitely different and that we have to be thinking about. The next one here is enforcement of audit logging and detailed system actions. So this is a little different. So, some people may or may not be familiar, but audit logging, my example we'll talk about is related to healthcare. Systems will be required to audit and actually track user actions in alignment with compliance policies for a variety of reasons. And again, I won't drill too deep into the actual compliance law or the reason why for a specific requirement, but it's going to happen in a lot of these environments. And we also have to be aware that on the test management system, and we'll talk a little about tooling, but basically logging and having that track and that history of what's happening both at the system under test and what we're doing for test management is really important. So we'll get into a little bit about that as well. The third thing here is defining requirements for disaster recovery and data retention. When we talk about quality assurance, this admittedly is a little overlap on what I traditionally would know is cloud engineering or SRE, like site reliability engineering. But we'll get into details about this where, most of us here may have the title quality assurance or QA, and we're under auditing or accountability for these things. It really is everybody, in addition to our responsibility to understand and validate what we're doing for data retention, recovery, and disaster recovery failover type situations. That's really important. I think it's one of the most overlooked aspects around software quality and teams, and how I have a good amount of experience doing this. We're going to talk about that today as well. And then the last thing here is just keeping high standards for traceability, what I'll call audit readiness. I participated in various audits through various products, and there's a lot of lessons learned and things that we can look at for being audit ready all the time. So hopefully if anybody here is maybe preparing for an audit or thinking about what they need to be doing, this will help. So let's get into our next section. We'll talk about testing considerations. This really follows a core for both teams in regulated environments, but maybe you're not working in one now or you're just curious. This really applies to everybody. If you're doing software testing, QA, work in a development team. So our first section here is focusing on requirements and traceability. Really very testing 101. And I have some screenshots here, and obviously, like I'm overlaying some aspects of TestRail. This doesn't specifically rely on TestRail if your teams are currently not using it, but I'll reference some screenshots related to TestRail Enterprise because it's relevant. Specifically for traceability, tests and requirements should be tightly coupled and documented, meaning we shouldn't have what I call stranded tests or stranded requirements, where we have a requirement, we don't really see where the testing is taking place, or we're doing testing, but we don't really know why we're doing it or why it originated. The screenshot on the right, and a lot of you may use various tools for like Jira type integrations. Again, this is from TestRail Enterprise, where we have a specific test case and we show linkage back to with our Jira integration capabilities. So you can see here's the test. It's just a generic sample from one of our sandboxes, but you can see here's a requirement reflected as a Jira issue or story. And then we have linkage back to the actual test case. Whether it's automated or manual, it doesn't matter. The format's the same and it should be the same, where we can show linkage in some mechanism to show the testing we're doing and why, or having the requirement defined and how we're validating it. So that should be something that's very clear and again applies really to all testing teams. The next one here is basically having centralized repositories for automated and manual testing. Again, I've worked on teams where I've come in and we don't really have this, and it's very hard to both demonstrate traceability, audit readiness. It's kind of a downward kind of cascading dependency of issues if you really don't have this, right? So, some teams may use GitHub or GitLab or other version tracking or source management tools for automation, but that may be segregated and not integrated into manual testing. And then we start talking about release and milestone events, what testing's happening, how we can then link it, and it becomes very difficult and disjointed. And then this gets, we're in an uncomfortable spot when we're looking at requirements traceability for auditing or compliance related requirements. So having a central repository where everything's at and we can manage it is really critical to be successful. And then the third thing here is really integration with that agile or work management, work tracker platform. Again, in this example, we talk about Jira. A lot of people use Jira. It could be GitLab for GitLab issues. It could be version 1 maybe, or whatever your team is using, having a tight integration, again, so we know where the requirements are then created and defined and then are linked to our tests. Or if we look at a test, we can say, why are we testing this? We have a requirement that's tracked up to a story, an epic, maybe a theme, and these things are highly visible. It makes everything better. It makes us very accountable for the work that we're doing. Switching gears a little bit, and again, this may seem a little untraditional. We're thinking about functional testing. I want to talk next about validation of security and access controls. This is not a spinoff for a security webinar. It's relevant in the domain of regulated environments. So I don't know if those in the audience are aware of like OWASP as a kind of open source community organization around mainly security topics. This applies in this regulated environment just because the proliferation of security and cyber attacks and then type of data and information that we need to secure. So these are things we need to be really thinking about when we're looking at testing strategy and approach. I've been on teams and I've seen teams that have not been doing this. The teams I've been on, we've done this rigorously, again, just because of the environments that I've worked in. But OWASP basically publishes what they call their top 10. And it's usually every like 2 or 3 years, or they'll have revisions. The last revision, this is this A1 2021 revision, which is the #1 item, is essentially access controls for their sample or their studies showed basically some form of broken access controls. And what that really means or comes down to are these 3 things that we should be testing for. And if you're not, this is a good something good for you to start thinking about. unauthorized access. When you're doing testing, negative case, happy path, edge cases, these should be kind of interwoven around this unauthorized access, and we should be thinking about it for both the API and the UI. So if we do valid credentials, we should do invalid credentials. If we should do expired credentials. And again, this shouldn't be just something we do at the UI, it should be at the API. And that may seem simple for teams maybe that are advanced or have experience, but there's a lot of findings where maybe the UI does some validation, but the API is completely unexposed and left unvalidated. And these are really areas of high consequence when we start talking about regulated environments in unauthorized access. So definitely think about that when you're doing your test planning. The next one here is role-based testing. Everybody's familiar with this, at least in some aspect, where maybe you have read-only access or admin access. And this, again, may apply differently to the systems under test that everybody is currently working on, or platforms. But we should be thinking about that. Specifically, maybe if I'm assigned a read-only access right, am I able to go and change other users as an admin? That's probably not good and expected. And that whole concept, which we'll talk a little more about for least privileges, is something that we need to really enforce as a quality assurance team or in a QA leadership role, or even an engineer in a team. Take responsibility for that. And then the last thing here, which I think is the most understated of all of these, and I've actually seen the most issues around this, is IP-based whitelisting and restrictions. And really what I've seen with this is working on site nuclear facilities, even in the healthcare space. A lot of applications and access are driven specifically for IP-based whitelisting and blacklisting. What I mean by that is when you're on site in an intranet or a specific network, you may have access to certain resources whenever you are, for say, at home, or what I used to do is tether to a Wi-Fi hotspot and then run our tests, is basically do that negative testing. If you disconnect out of the intranet or a secure network and maybe go to a public network or tether off of your smartphone, we need to make sure what network restrictions and firewall applications that are being used are in place and working right, because we can expose data. So these are three really good things to think about, more a little on the security side, but it relates to functional testing in these highly regulated industries. Okay, so another big one here. So we're going to start talking a little bit about test data restrictions. So test data restrictions, we mentioned in like one of our first slides around data privacy and how we use and leverage data for our testing. And this is very sensitive. I've dealt with this for the majority of my entire software testing and just software career in general. Data for the context of testing, we need to be really careful of how and what we use and understand the laws. My general statement with this is, talk to your legal or compliance officers if you're not sure, and definitely ask before you do it. There's, some issues that can come out of using this or leaking it. So the example I have here, we'll talk about that first and then talk about some of the bullets, is a pretend kind of patient list. I just did this in like TextPad. This is not real information, but you can see in the top, maybe this is some type of delimited file that has a list of patients. So you'll see my name, maybe there's a username for a system, maybe an identifier, and let's pretend maybe this is in a medical setting. I called it a patient list. Maybe it's a medical record number or an MRN number, and then maybe my first name, last name, so you can see that information. Again, not diving too deep from the US perspective, in a HIPAA compliance scenario, we kind of classify this as PHI, or patient health information, which is heavily regulated and guarded. And I work with a lot in my prior position. And what we want to do is start looking at ways to either not use it or maybe de-identify it. So you'll see in the bottom here, and again, we can have a whole spinoff on methods of seeding data and de-identification. But basically, you can just see visually the difference. We have exposed and maybe valid PHI, even though it's not in this example. And the bottom would be a sample of a file that we've then de-identified that we can leverage for testing. And that's just one strategy we want to use once we have a really thorough understanding of what we can and cannot use, what may be patient health information or restricted data. The last thing that we can do, and it's my middle bullet here, and I'm a really big proponent of it, is leveraging property-based testing. And if everybody on here is not aware of what that is, I'll give a very quick example. I don't have a slide for it, but if we need to validate a field, there's a form in a web form, and it takes numbers. Maybe it's a medical record number that is integers only. We don't need to store real medical record numbers for patients. We can randomly generate a string of letters, numbers, alphanumeric, integer, decimal. We can generate these dynamically and test the property of the field, which is a numeric validation. We don't have to store actual data to test the property of a given field being numeric. So leveraging property-based testing is a great way to not store data or have data requirements for fields. So think kind of outside the box when you're leveraging data. It'll definitely help. As a side note, before we move on, one great library for those of you that use JavaScript or an NPM for your frameworks is a library called Faker. So you can look at that, which will help with that too. Okay, so let's get into a little bit of logging. Talked about this at the beginning. We're going to talk about it twice, but this is the first portion of it. A lot of systems in these environments, in this example I'm giving, I'm pulling a little bit again from my healthcare background because they have a lot of logging standards that are actually very structured. A lot of these systems will enforce various types of logging. And I've seen QA teams and people look at this and say, well, the system does logging, the engineering team implements it, or maybe our cloud team just makes sure it happens. This is really responsibility of not only the teams, but specifically those involved and responsible for software quality, which really should be everybody. But if you're a QA engineer, test engineer, quality assurance analyst, this really even hits home for you, in my opinion, to make sure this is working. We'll talk about why. The standard that I have here, imagine a user goes and does a login, or someone is even trying to access a system that they don't have access to. So valid, invalid logins. A lot of these healthcare systems will implement actual very detailed logging so we can go and do investigation, or if we have a data breach, or just for a variety of reasons. The format that we use, there's multiple ways of doing this using like Fire Standard. There's a way that I specify here, just an example, is in XML. It's called the DICOM standard. So it's an XML format that basically, and you can see they're kind of cryptic. So you'll see there's participant object IDs or a participant object name, and the development team would define these in their actual logging infrastructure. But it builds an XML payload that essentially defines all of the actions happening based on a known standard. And you can Google the DICOM standard and look at it if you're, offline and look at it if you're interested. But basically the DICOM standard, or any other standard, Fire is another one, basically structures and defines these actions for later review, searching. A lot of teams, or I've used Splunk for this type of activity. But what we really need to focus on are really three areas around validation of it. Finding out if your system does this logging could be a first step. Maybe you don't know, but we need to at least look at happy path logging events. So if we go and log in, do we know compliance logs are being generated? Can we validate these against some basic scenarios? Maybe we deploy the application new. Do we go and check that the app logs have been created if we go and do a login event? We used to do this all the time, both pre-prod and in production, anytime we deploy. Access denial events. This is kind of that happy path versus unhappy path, or positive and negative case. If we have someone that's trying to access the system that shouldn't be, or maybe they, forgot their password, it really doesn't matter. Denial events or illicit access events should be tracked as well. Ideally they shouldn't receive data or be able to access it, but we should be logging and validating that. And then the last thing around this, and I've actually seen a lot of issues with this too, just because of server time versus, region specific or data, or, region or time zone adjusted. There's all types of ways you can reflect time zones. One thing we need to validate is essentially the time zone and the conversion of time zones for the events that are happening for this logging are correct. We don't want to go and look and somehow there's a time zone or an audit log that was generated today that was dated for 3 days ago or 2 days in the past because the date conversions were incorrect or something. So we want to make sure that our time stamp artifacts are actually accurate and valid to correlate to the actions being performed. Identify if you have compliance logging, and we should really be validating the logging that's happening. On to disaster recovery. So I am not assuming that most of our audience is running applications on a Windows laptop, but everybody I think has seen the blue screen of death at one point in time in their career or maybe personally on a device. So disasters happen. I've worked a lot, again, in my previous position with a lot of AWS cloud-based deployments, and I'm familiar and I've been dabbling with my developer certification for AWS. So I'm aware we have a lot of really advanced infrastructure nowadays that probably a lot of you are using. We're not as much questioning the infrastructure, but we really want to go and define scenarios that map requirements for the system under test when disaster recovery or failover happens. I undoubtedly know that point in time RDS restores for AWS work. I've done them several times. We're not doing that type of testing, but we need to understand what type of specific configuration scenarios for your system. And it may be something more manual for on-prem solutions. Maybe you don't have cloud-based system or environment or tool that you're working on. But the big thing here is the second bullet here is we really need to simulate these. And a lot of people say, well, why are you spending time doing that? Or is that really a requirement? Compliance frameworks, and again, I won't get too detailed, like HITRUST, a lot of times enforce what I'll call regular disaster recovery and failover audits and evaluations for how you recover the system and what that really looks like. So simulating disasters, and we did it like almost every quarter. Some systems we did it yearly. Basically look at, what if the database fails? We have data corruption. Maybe it's a ransomware attack. Maybe for on the AWS side, sometimes EC2s get terminated, torn down, restarted. Data persistence. So when we talk about these disaster recoveries, we need to map out what is plausible and what we want to be resilient against, mapped to whatever our SLAs are. And there's a lot of factors, but thinking about it and creating requirements is really a big thing. And then the other side of it is we need to start to actually validate this stuff. Similar to testing requirements for functional correctness, we need to actually test the requirements we have for our disaster recovery, failover, and data retention. A scenario, a very easy one that I give is, maybe we have a batch job and it runs every night. We push new release and somehow in production data only, the batch job wiped out 3/4 of these operational tables. Maybe in our operational database, maybe not the data warehouse, and we have all kinds of issues. Well, how easily and quickly do we know that we can do a database restore, and how long does it take? What are the impacts of that? Can we validate that and know the system's going to work after the system is then brought back up? Do we have networking that has to be connected? So all these things I think you'll be surprised at don't go smoothly. Again, not at the fault of GCP or AWS, because all these tools provide great recovery, disaster recovery, and failover capability, but putting them together and actually exercising with your implementation is really important. So we talk a lot about a lot of different testing considerations. We're thinking about good testing strategy. Maybe we're putting plans in place. Now is the harder part that I think is how we're documenting and quality and actually tracking quality of record for the actual testing process all the time. Stories are coming through as we're doing releases, we're doing all this stuff. So we're back to access controls. You'll see a similar theme here about our system under test versus how we're doing quality of record. It's very similar. So maintaining a least privileges approach does not apply just to the product that you work on. It should apply to the testing artifacts and access to them that the team has. And if that seems slightly shocking, I'll give you a scenario really quickly. And I've seen this again in my personal experience is, hey, we're going to do an automation run and we update all these records. Maybe we have a new person on the team or we borrowed someone from another team to help us work on a release. And the release just goes out and all of a sudden someone goes and reruns automation. And the way automation is configured or pointed to port data and store it, we overwrite the test records that were the official final test run for the release tag with something on the develop branch that was not the release branch. So we essentially have wiped out our test quality of record for the major release that just happened. Where did they go? How did this person have access? Were they even working in the release? Well, no, they're helping out while the team is pivoted to finish the release testing or run the last bit of automation in the pipeline or something. Having access controls at a test management level and hopefully having some type of test management. That's why this is even more important. Having scattered artifacts or things on shared drives, it just makes it really hard. So anyhow, you'll see in the screenshots here, this is from TestRail Enterprise. We talk a little bit about role-based access. This is really nice because we can specifically assign roles whether it's an automation role, if you're using like for our automation integrations, we have some stuff out there that you can leverage, or just actual people logging in and doing manual testing. So we can specify these access matrix basically for a tester, a manager, a designer, maybe read only if we just want people to look at it, or maybe more reviewer type profiles, or developers for those in the team. We can create these type of roles and give access of least privileges so we maintain good quality of record and we don't wipe out, you know, the last release that we had of our final test records, data, test cases, and now we have to face an audit. Where did the test records go? Well, we don't have them because we wiped them out. You know, that's not a great position to be in. And then the second one here is managing the user access roster. I mean, again, I've just seen confusion around this with test management platforms I've worked on, even like Git repos, different things. We have people that join teams, they leave, or we, you know, share them out to other teams, and especially teams that are more distributed or have like almost like testing center of excellence, where we have a pool of people that maybe help multiple projects. Really managing who has access to what and what specific features. Again, this screenshot on the bottom right shows kind of like how we restrict it in TestRail. It may be more manual if you're less centralized or have multiple tools, but thinking about that is really a key concept, not as much the tool. So make sure everybody has relevant and legitimate access, but at a least privileges approach. So the next one here is really big. And I mean, I think that this really applies to regulated and even unregulated industries. We need to have good release test history. You know, if teams are maybe working on, I've seen like internal tools and the history of how the releases and the traceability may be a little more relaxed. It's really the opposite when we start looking at kind of mission critical applications. You know, I'll go back to tools that are leveraged for really demanding and important processes in nuclear, software tools in healthcare, like I've worked on, that leverage and, you know, use people's very you know, restricted patient health information. We have to be really careful of how we track and understand the test history and everything that was validated and done release to release, whether it's a hot fix, major release, minor release, doesn't matter. Traceable test execution should align to release event version. So you'll see here, like, again, like I've just shown some snippets for examples in TestRail. Ideally, if you're using some type of tool that provides dashboards or metrics that gives you a holistic view, you'll see like I made up like regression 2.6.1. Here's a dashboard for TestRail with, you know, testing that might have happened, testing that's untested, tests that have failed. This would integrate like both manual and automated testing from a TestRail perspective. You may have to aggregate it manually if you're not using something like that. But having a dashboard combined, however you're doing it, really is important because, you know, if we have issues, and I hate to say that, but like if we have escaped issues or hopefully we don't, but like compliance problems, maybe we have leaked data or we have a security issue, we get into root cause analysis or again, like compliance related findings or assessors come in. I've seen kind of samplings of these. I really, thankfully, not of the teams I've worked on, but I've seen projects that have had issues. Basically, this is something where we would go back and understand what testing was done, what we validated, maybe gaps, and it may also help in correcting issues, looking at what we missed. Having good release test history is really important. Failed issues in tests, and I'll mention this multiple times, should be linked with the defect artifact. And this is like one of my big, like, end of release checklist things mentally, and then we actually got like a checklist that I would go through just myself as in a lead position. I would go both in our automated and manual test results and anything we have. If there's something that's failed, we always should have a linked defect. I think it's easy for teams to say, well, this failed, we're good, but have nothing actionable to represent the issue, the defect, the actual exception, system issue, whatever you want to call it. And this is really prime when we have auditing and sampling of auditors will look at these things, you know, show me a test or a failure, link to a requirement. How do you track it? What is your method of resolution? Those things really need to be tightly coupled. And then the last thing is just timestamps reflecting the time of execution. You know, if we do regression and the release ended last week, but we all of a sudden have a new test run tagged with the 2.6.1 release as a milestone or some way to track it. Hopefully the teams, you know, you guys are doing this release to release where you're tracking it. And then we see it a week or two after the release. The credibility of the results are questionable, or we don't know when it happened. timestamps are really critical, so we know when this stuff has been done. Again, should look similar to our system under test. Talking about audit logging, and I'll be quick with this one. A lot of teams that I've been on or don't have a lot of tooling or centralized test management. It's hard to do this outside of code, like in Git or something, but that's not comprehensive to everything, especially manual testing in some cases. Basically, audit logging we should treat the same way as we do for validating audit logging in our system under test as we do for our tests. And the best example, and I mentioned it before, was specifically around, we have a new person on the team, or maybe we borrow someone from another team. They go and kick off automation. I've actually seen this. And the results that we had tagged for the release that went out, we now overwrote them. And we don't know what the actual test results were for like a minor or major release. I've seen this happen. For an auditing perspective, test case versioning and test management level auditing, we can go back and look and say, oh, we know what happened. Maybe we can recover the data. Or in an audit situation, it may be as simple as an auditor goes and says, I'm going to sample this test. This test went from failed to passed. Why did that happen? We need to show did you update a requirement? Like, why are we changing tests from a failure status and then to a pass status? And this is just a screenshot from TestRail Enterprise. It shows like some audit level logging. And I say again, however tooling that you have or configured to be able to do this, definitely be thinking about it. I've seen that type of question both from audit level and also from just like overriding results and understanding what happened and tracking this back to an actual test version or a project or a date or time. So we're kind of building upon this idea of traceability, auditing, control of our tests, centralizing how we control all this information as we're, maybe doing agile, waterfall, or even hybrid type development. We're building kind of this quality of record process. And the last kind of build up to this really is talking about test summary and approvals. I've done a lot of this with a lot of different organizations. And the idea here, and I'll come back to, and I'm not going to get too deep, but like I know like frameworks like HITRUST as a compliance framework, and I know there's others or even industries, like to see actual approvals on a given release event. So having a dashboard or something that provides thorough yet high-level-ish documentation on the configurations and the state of risk is really important. This is like a sample report. In TestRail, we have tons of them. I'm sure there's open source tools and dashboards. Again, like the whole idea from my perspective, like when I'm working on teams, is I want to consolidate automation, manual testing, and have this sole source where I can easily build reporting. It doesn't take a lot of time and it's accurate. So this example for this, like I said, it's kind of like a TestRail dashboard snippet. Can see our pass rate, how much are we retesting, failed, tests that are blocked, and we can use this to leverage for approvals. We did in-person approval meetings on the teams I've been on where I would present this, here's our approval, maybe we overlay a risk summary. I've, seen the whole high, medium, low, red, green, yellow, and we would have a risk statement and then a dashboard report for all the testing, disaster recovery, manual, automation, everything that's happened is basically put in front of our leadership or stakeholders. Basically make a determination if we're going to release at risk, make a decision, and then document the decision for the approval event. As we do that, I think it's really important to follow a process and document the approval. And again, this relates to auditing considerations and really just overall good process for the team to understand what's going on and what are the risks around it. Okay, so kind of switching again in alignment with the first section of our presentation or the webinar, talking about data retention and backup. So we mentioned about access or data recovery, disaster recovery, failover. We need to be thinking about this not only on the system under test. Everybody should get the theme of how we're overlaying and kind of building this. We need to be thinking about this for our test artifacts. I'll give another example just in my personal career. A lot of times teams, it's a project we took over and we came in and the teams were running this on a pipeline. So we would have, this is using basically AWS EC2s as kind of a node to spin up, and we would run processes as part of a CI/CD pipeline on it. And as part of that, we would actually go, and actually our team wasn't, we took this project over, and these test results would get stored locally on Kind of think of it as like a kind of like a node or a worker that would get spun up as part of cloud resources, and our test results that we're getting put on here, right? We're trying to centralize this stuff. We had some interim releases, and as we go to release cloud infrastructure, our teams, we basically the EC2 got terminated and restored just based on OS patching, right? Constantly patching the OS to eliminate any vulnerabilities, all good practice. What we didn't realize is the data that was on the actual or the data that the test results were being stored on was on this basically like virtual machine essentially that was not persistent storage. So we had no way of backing up. We didn't know about it. Thankfully it was well before release time and we can kind of change our infrastructure. But having a place where we have persistent storage that doesn't maybe just get restarted and all of a sudden your test data is gone or your automation runs, we really want to think about data retention and backup for the artifacts that we're producing incrementally for testing specifically. So if we're running automation, within our sprint, maybe we do automation on a tagged code branch version that is going to be the release candidate or the actual production release. All these artifacts need to be in a place where they cannot get lost. And when I say lost, think of the same type of disaster recovery we did for our system testing related to this, cloud storage maybe, or something gets wiped out, maybe not intentionally, right? Maybe it's an access control issue. Maybe we store data in a database and the database, goes down or gets corrupted. So we have a lot of things that we can do for infrastructure that we should apply for our test management. Without getting into a lot of mechanisms, and like TestRail Enterprise, I come back to like having centralized stuff. It makes it easier to manage both creation, how you store it, and then the recovery. So we have like a full backup restore that's built into TestRail. I've seen teams do it otherwise with more effort around building more custom frameworks where they may do incremental backups or store like on like AWS S3 or different artifact repos, but these are more manual processes. Having a central place that is backed up and restorable is really critical, just for the fact of one, you want to maintain test record, and two, maybe you have an audit coming up and you have some good quality records and all of a sudden you lose these and you can't get them back. You have some major gaps for now compliance and audit to answer for, to say why we don't have any test quality of record for releases. And that puts us in a really bad position, which we don't want to be in. So thinking about data retention and backup for your testing artifacts is really important. So we're kind of ramping down, and I mentioned at the beginning, we always want to talk about in these webinars, ways to improve, right? Everybody wants to get better, and specifically continuous improvement for regulated industries. And what are some things we can focus on? And again, I'm just kind of pulling from my background and experience. The biggest thing I found that helps teams is not waiting until you have an audit, or worst case yet, getting audit findings or compliance violations. These are really all bad things. Really, we should be able to avoid. All the teams that work in these environments should be thinking about this ahead of time. Create spikes if you're working in agile environments, or create scope or part of release scoping and more hybrid or waterfall, and plan ahead. Doing self-assessments is one of the biggest things. I worked in nuclear. We used to do this not just in software scope, and in engineering space, even cross organizations, different nuclear utilities. I've been a part of self-assessments on improving process, where we basically pretend we're our auditor or assessor and look at critical things that we would be judged on internally to basically drive improvements. So conduct self-assessments to basically improve, sample these things and see where you stand. And that would be a good takeaway for today if you're thinking about where to start. Really basic things I like to look at, we've done. Linkage of test to requirements. If I close my eyes, I jokingly say in teams, if I close my eyes and I go and pick a JIRA story, how easily can I identify the exact amount of testing, where it was tested, and the result? If we can't do that in a lot of areas, or we have a hard time finding it, it's not going to get better in an audit scenario. And the longer it goes and the more you create and don't have this, and they have disjointed requirements traceability, it's not going to get better. It's going to get worse. So linkage of test to requirements, see where you're at, be realistic and honest. Tests should be in final status. And I go back to what I mentioned earlier. If I have bugs, and you'll see this is like a TestRail, this is one of our summary dashboards. We can see like defects specifically logged to a release, results, test runs. So for that 80 defects in this bottom example, maybe we export and do an export of the graph and the drill down on results. Let's pick a defect. Do we have tests that are associated to a defect that's closed? versus maybe we have a failed test that doesn't have a defect linked to it. So we found an issue, but we didn't create a bug, or we have a bug, it got closed, but maybe we didn't validate the issue or link an actual automated or manual test to validate the defect, because it's different than a story. So all these things need to be happening. And then the last thing here is, how strong is our relation of executed tests to a given release event? The 2.61 release that happened last Tuesday, can I see every test that was run, the status, when it was executed, including disaster recovery, performance testing, manual and automated? Are they in one spot? Are they in like 4 different places? Are they on Joe or Sally's computer or share drive, but they're not here, so we can't access it? So all these different things play into how effective we are in basically self-assessing where the team stands. So I encourage everybody to do this if you don't know where to start from today's webinar. Okay, so kind of wrapping up here, and we'll get into some questions, but really big key takeaways: focus on traceability and linkage of tester requirements. One of the key pillars of software testing in general, but really for regulated environments. Think about security and access control testing. It's not the security team's job. It's a functional aspect with a nuance to security. Everybody, we really should be thinking about it. Really having a centralized place to manage all of your tests, access, artifacts, data retention, backup, results. One spot is better than disjointed locations, and I've seen that over and over as a theme of teams that succeed or teams that have issues. Plan and think about disaster recovery. Maybe you don't even know if that's happening yet. Talk to your cloud services or engineering teams and get involved. I've seen this come up during audits. I've heard people ask about this and how the resiliency of applications. Document and get test approvals. When releases are going out, we need to have stakeholder buy-off. Everybody should understand the risk. And for regulated industries, we need to have something formal. And then the last thing here is, perform self-assessments. That's, again, I think that's one of the better takeaways is for the team is, think about and plan in your teams where we really stand, where we at in all these topics. And you can start to fill your backlogs or look at tech debt to find ways to improve.